So in the last video, I think I spoke about how hard it is to get the heater box back into the engine bay. I actually ended up taking out the steering master box over there and stripping back all that corner in there and the firewall and the shelf along there. I stripped all that back, and in a way I'm glad I did, because under the steering box was a whole lot, was probably be about 50 years worth of grime, and a couple of things I read online and a couple of people said that this area here is a notorious spot for P6s rusting out. So what I've done in this area was, like I said, I took the steering box out, stripped all the paint out in this corner along here, all the paint along the firewall as well. I've got new Dynamat insulation there. I've got it on the shelf as well. So the the heater box sits on it. I had a new gasket for the heater box as well. I think it's a Land Rover part. I have it in the video somewhere, buried on my iPhone if anyone's interested, but that went on, and I repainted along here. I've repainted this panel here because it was pretty scratched up. And I've also touched up the engine bay around here and got onto some rust that started to form from the fluid reservoir that was leaking and dripping down into the engine bay. So that's some of the work I did. What started as a simple thing of, oh, the heater box is leaking, I'll just take it out and fix everything while I'm here, snowballed and took the better part. The heater box alone took months and months to rebuild, just because I got a few things wrong and test fitting things and putting it back together and things like that. And then putting it back in the car was frustrating as well, because it's such a tight fit with this steering box here that I ended up scratching my perfect paint on it, but I'll touch it up in there. And then actually it also got scratched test fitting the engine and gearbox going back in. So what can you do? The other thing I found as well was that there was a whole lot of road grime sitting down in here. There's actually kind of like a V in there as well. So I got in there and put anti-rust paint and then undercoat and then gloss in that corner as well. So I still have to do this corner, and this panel and the fluid reservoir, along with the radiator support panel that got a bit beaten up at one stage. But my next plan of attack is to swap over the water pumps. That's today's job. Engine and transmission in for sizing up what gearbox mount to make. Engine and transmission back out, and then I will finish off the cosmetic part of the engine bay. So today I'll be taking off this water pump off the 4.6 and putting this one off the 3.5 onto the 4.6. It actually looks kind of new, so that might have got changed before the car got taken off the road with the broken auto. That's today's job. One of the other things that caught me out as well was a shifter housing for the Toyota transmission here. So you can see here, got the bell housing. I had to shave down part of the bell housing. I also had to shave down part of one of the body weld joins in the transmission tunnel, which I'll show in a moment. And the shifter housing I had the shifter located about here, and I needed one as far back as possible. I bought a remote shifter housing, but this transmission doesn't have the mounting lugs for it, so I was lucky enough to find this one. And then I had to buy a plastic shifter bush for in here. I bought one from a well-known part supplier that does conversions and things like that, and it was absolute garbage. So I'll probably just get a factory Toyota one to sit inside there, and that's where the actual shifter sits, inside this metal case. When you change this though, you have to break the transmission and actually take off this entire housing. If anyone's interested in how to do that, I did take video of it and some photos just in case you need to do it for your Rover, but I figure if I can do it, it's pretty straightforward. And here we have down here, that's the Rover automatic transmission gearbox crossmember, and I need to modify it so that it can take the Toyota rubber mount. So I'll either modify or make one from scratch. There we go. So it sits like that from memory. I think that side is on the driver's side. So there's some of the things I've been up to in the last couple of months. I just mentioned before about notching or modifying the transmission tunnel to fit in the bell housing, the nose of the starter motor, and this is what I'm talking about here. So I haven't cut through the body seam entirely. I've just cut it into a U shape, for want of a better word. And you can actually see here where the bell housing has been hitting on the transmission tunnel when we've taken it in and out of the car, but it is not a, it will just bolt in fit, like you will read online in a few places. You do need to make a few modifications to get that starter nose to fit and not hit the transmission tunnel. And this was also a factory automatic car, so it has the even bigger transmission tunnel. If people haven't modified it in the past, I'd love to know how they did it, because there was no way it was going to fit in there without either shaving the bell housing right down and having the gears exposed on the starter, or doing what I've done and actually clearancing the transmission tunnel. In the pedal box video, I spoke about having the two master cylinders here. So we've got our clutch and our brake and the European left-hand drive bracket. So you can see what I mean. In an ideal world, this tube would be here to get this up and away from the exhaust. If there's a fabricator or a 3D printing person in Melbourne that would like to work with me to punch out a few of these for conversions out there, let me know, because I think there is a market to produce these to use this setup rather than the complicated setup that has the clutch master mounted in there, where you have to, no, sorry, it's over here, where you have to cut a big hole right about there in your inner body shell. So I like this setup. I think it's pretty clean. And these are the generic master cylinders that I bought off eBay. Again, thank you, Fraser, for the heads up. But yes, they will need to be heat wrapped, or you can actually buy a blanket that goes around master cylinders from a few online retailers, and I'll also wrap the exhaust pipe on these. I think it's, I can't remember which cylinders are. There's two exhaust ports. They're very close to here, so I'll be putting some exhaust wrap on there. But yes, that's the left-hand drive mounting bracket for a 3500S or manual car. So today's job was to take the factory P6B water pump off. I actually remember now vaguely when I was a kid or a teenager that this got reconditioned. So the housing has been cleaned up and the inner parts of the pump have been changed. I think it's got a new viscous coupling on it, and the gasket is new, and someone's been in here because there's sealant on the bolts and things like that. And then I took the pump off the 4.6, and someone has pointed out on the Rover forum that this is probably a Buick timing cover, because it has the V at the front there, which goes in front of the sump, which is interesting. Not sure how that ended up in Australia, but anyway. And this is dried up coolant that has been sitting in there. So a timely reminder to change your coolant regularly and to use good coolant. So I will flush out the block. I will order a new gasket for the water pump because I wasn't quite sure, because how dirty it was on the block side. I wasn't sure if it used a gasket or they'd use sealant. They've used a gasket on this one and on the 4.6 pump, which is over here. So I've just bolted this in. It interchanges, that's fine, great. I'll also clean up all the bolts on this one and the other one over there because they're pretty dirty and the threads look like they could use a good clean as well. And what I'll also do, even though this pulley lines up with this one, which means that this pulley will line up with this pulley for some reason. On the 4.6 here, they're the same size. On that 3.5, the factory one, the front pulley is slightly larger. I'm not sure, don't know the logic behind it. Maybe to slow down the pump speed, speed up the pump speed, not sure. But I will try and I'll just undo these 3 nuts and see if I can get this pulley off and that one as well, and then swap the 2 over. So one last thing on 4.6 conversions or even Rover V8s with EFI going into carbureted cars, you'll need to have a timing cover that has an allowance for a distributor. And if you're going to keep all the P6B style ancillaries, or maybe even if you're doing this conversion into a P5B, same thing, I guess. If your car has got power steering and air conditioning, you'll need the bracket that goes on this side, which I'll show in a second. And you'll also need to swap over your alternator bracket. Me personally, I would swap over the ancillary brackets to suit the car rather than run the larger engine with the factory brackets, because a lot of the ancillaries off the larger engine, you'll run into headaches trying to get them to work with the car body itself, such as different power steering pumps have different line pressures. The aircon setups are completely different from old cars versus new cars, things like that. So this one here, it bolts straight on, no problems. This will get a tidy up and then I'll bolt it on permanently. The other thing with this is this works fine, this factory P6 bracket with the Bosch alternator I have, but it's at the limit of its extension. And ideally I would have a smaller belt, which I'll do once the car is back together, because then that would give me some adjustment as the belt starts to age. The other thing over here is this monstrosity. So this is a bracket for a P6B with air conditioning and power steering. So it goes on the side of the engine like this, and the power steering goes down there. Your air conditioning compressor goes up the top there, and then you have this giant hole in there so that you can actually adjust things. I can't remember what it was for exactly, but I found that when I took that off, part of it was clean, part of it was covered in about 1 inch of grime, and part of it was actually rusty. So I tidied the whole thing up, and it took me a while to get it done because it's been so cold here in Melbourne that the paint wasn't drying outside, so I actually baked it in the oven. So here we can see 3.5 with everything stripped off it. So alternator bracket there, that big bracket down here, and then you can see that if you wanted to, you could even take the P6B timing cover, I think, and swap that straight over to your 4.6. Just on swapping over P6B timing cases, timing covers rather, onto later blocks. The SD1 has a better oil pump from memory than a P6B, but if you swap in a SD1 oil pump, it has a different thread fitting on the nose here. So you have to remember to order SD1 oil filters, not P6B oil filters. and there we go. You can see those 3 nuts there. So hopefully this unbolts and swaps straight over onto the 4.6 nose. Hopefully that's been of help to people out there, and I'll see you in the next video.